Hey, Sasha Lenko here. I help write and produce the Reconnect America podcast. We're currently working on putting together our next few major episodes. They're going to focus on the deregulation of the railroad industry between 1970 and 1980, the massive loss of service that followed, and what it meant for communities that got left behind, and for all of us in the United States. It's a pretty big story to tell, and we're putting a lot of work into getting it right. So, in the meantime, we wanted to share something that we thought would help frame the material we're about to dive into by situating what we're learning about rail transport within the broader movements and transformations that the US economy has undergone over the past 150 years or so. The conversation you're about to hear took place between Solutionary Rail Director and Reconnect America host Bill Moyer and Basel Musharbash earlier this year. Basel is the author of the 2024 report, Kings Over the Necessaries of Life, Monopolization and the Elimination of Competition in America's Agricultural System, published by Farm Action. We'll put a link in the show notes. Basel is also principal attorney at Antimonopoly Council, where he works on antitrust law and trade regulation, defending farmers, small businesses, workers, and consumers. The conversation spans pretty much the entire history of anti-monopoly and antitrust regulation and deregulation in the United States, from Thomas Jefferson's desire for stronger anti-monopoly protections in the Constitution to the rollback of New Deal-era regulations in the 1970s and 80s, and the widespread desire for change today. Throughout all of these developments, it is fascinating to see, on the one hand, just how central railroads have always been to the national economy, and on the other hand, how the demands we have made of railroads, in the form of regulations requiring them to serve public interests, have often accorded with a broader picture of what we expect of the private sector more generally. Here is our conversation with Basel Musharbash.
Well, really appreciate you coming on and doing this conversation with us. I got quite a bit into your paper. It was interesting the way you structured it. It seemed like the first section is where you were laying out sort of the history of the patterns of regulation or lack of regulation. And then the rest of it was sector by sector sort of case studies of how the lack of regulatory controls and protection around antitrust consolidation monopolies sort of plays out in the current system. It's pretty freaking impressive.
Thank you.
Yeah. What brought you into that work?
So I went to law school because I was interested in community development, community empowerment. And the reason I'd got into that is that I did an AmeriCorps year of service in the south suburbs of Chicago and sort of got to see how our local government law system makes it so that metro areas are fragmented, communities are fragmented, and so they can't really govern themselves and address the issues that affect them collectively. I went to law school sort of interested in this area of law, of local government law, but as I went through law school, I realized sort of the flip side of that problem of having a broken local government law system that doesn't allow communities to exercise power and govern effectively was the broken system of antitrust law, which is supposed to constrain the concentration of private power over communities. And that's how I got interested in antitrust. After law school, I worked at a firm that did sort of community development transactions, things like tax-advantaged real estate projects and the like. Quickly got disillusioned with that and got an opportunity to jump to work to an antitrust firm that focused on labor markets. In particular, they focused on helping workers that are being trapped by non-compete agreements by employers. Did that for some time, and then I got cancer at the ripe age of 30 years. But luckily it worked out. I'm still here. Everything turned out okay. But to go through treatment, I did end up moving back to my hometown of Paris, Texas. And after I came out of that, I decided to open my own firm and focus on doing the work that I really want to do. At the time, this is 2021, 2022, there was this swelling anti-monopoly movement with folks like Lena Khan being appointed to chair the Federal Trade Commission and Jonathan Cantor being appointed to lead the antitrust division of the Department of Justice. Both of those folks, true believers in revitalizing antitrust enforcement and recognizing the problem of concentrated power and control over our economic life in the United States. And I wanted to participate in that. So the law firm that I started focused on the one hand, helping groups that represent small farmers, small businesses, consumers lobby for anti-monopoly policy. I helped groups like Farm Action write regulatory comments to the Federal Trade Commission, the Department of Justice, the USDA, et cetera. And on the other hand, I did litigation, antitrust and consumer protection litigation, focused on representing the same groups, farmers, consumers, small businesses, and fighting back against monopolistic practices and deceptive practices in the marketplace. So that's how I got to do this report. One of my clients, Farm Action, we had worked together on regulatory comments responding to a lot of the anti-monopoly actions that were being taken by the Federal Trade Commission and the DOJ, and to some extent the USDA during the Biden administration. We had spent, 2 to 3 years doing a lot of research and writing very detailed comments to those agencies. And in that research, we uncovered a lot of the monopolization and the elimination of competition across the agricultural supply chain. And we wanted to sort of dig deeper into that and put it into a report that is not only giving the top lines about concentration in the agricultural supply chain, but that provides enough information that someone at an antitrust agency or someone who is advocating for anti-monopoly actions at any level of government could really take a look at this and find information that they can act upon. And that was sort of the genesis of the report. And it soon expanded after that, because the more we dug into each sector to try to figure out how did we get here? How did we get to the concentration of economic power that we see in fertilizer or in seeds or in meat packing? We realized that one, there was a common story to tell about the policies that were involved that facilitated that concentration of economic power. And there was a common story to be told about how earlier in our history, we made different policy choices that helped us for a time roll back the concentration of power and preserve competition and open markets, in those decades between the 1950s and 1980s. And so we wanted to spotlight both of those things, that history of acting against monopolies and, the current state of competition, which hopefully should give folks some insight into how we can rebuild competition and roll back concentration once again.
Well, it seems to me like it might help if I take a stab at trying to outline to you what I think our objectives are here and what made us so eager to reach out in a kind of an urgent way when we saw your piece. So we've been working to understand the impact of the rail system and its potential to serve public purposes and the public good. Many years ago, I read Lawrence Goodwin's The Populist Moment, and it talked about the Farmers Alliance movement and the Grange movement and such. So I had a little bit of background a while back, but didn't really know much about railroads at all. And then over the last decade, for the purpose of building an alliance around rail in the public interest and as a solution to a variety of problems, I got deeper and deeper into railroads and rail corridors and how they serve or don't serve the public interest. And in that process, it seemed clear to me starting a few years back that something shifted for the railroads. And this is before I really looked into the period of deregulation. And there seemed to be a reshaping of the infrastructure to serve a different economy. And the impact of that reshaping had a hollowing out effect for the communities. And I'm still grappling with what's the causal relationship, which caused which. But it seems that maybe there's an interwoven repurposing of the economy and the rural places to serve a particular set of interests. So I think that what I'm hoping to explore with you is how do we look at the early history and see how the Granger movement or these other anti-monopoly efforts or the regulatory frameworks protecting the public against antitrust were being established in relationship to this, what I would call a peculiar institution, another peculiar institution that the U.S. has, which was this idea that we would put infrastructure in the hands of private corporations. That I think is quite peculiar. And my hunch is that it's related to that other peculiar institution of slavery and the tension in the U.S. history between the powerful federal national government versus the power residing in states, and how the preservation of power residing in states and keeping a weak federal government prolonged the institution of slavery, and then also might have had some influence on how we approached infrastructure of rail. So I'm interested in that. I'm quite interested in hearing a little bit more of your tracing, going through some of the key segments like you do in the paper of antitrust, the evolution of antitrust, and then the reversal of antitrust, sort of the flipping on its head with Bork and others in regards to prioritizing the lower prices, et cetera. So I'd like to understand that a bit and have you talk about that. But I'm also interested in how this reorientation of the economy, this reorientation of the infrastructure itself and the regulatory system itself to facilitate this concentration of wealth and power. One of the things I hope we'll talk about is what might be the significance that the common carrier obligations of the railroads that once spanned all services and commodities was winnowed down to be just a few of these major commodities: oil, coal, grain, and some hazardous material, and explore whether there's some connection between what is prioritized for rail to continue to have to provide reasonable service for and the picture that you paint in your paper in regards to the consolidation of the agricultural sector, and not just the farms, but everything from the seeds to the equipment to the fertilizers to the precursors to the fertilizers to the pesticides to et cetera, and how it's been oriented and reoriented towards facilitating a globalized supply chain rather than a localized supply chain. Because ultimately, the case that we're attempting to also be making in another populist moment, this populist moment that we're living in, is that the infrastructure, the structure of what happens underneath, and I guess really the infrastructure that regulation is and how it shapes what is happening and how it shapes the economy, how it is in the interest of those people who feel aggrieved to take a look at the consolidation and the monopolization and to find some common cause in reversing this 50-year plus trend. That's kind of the arc of where I think that there's stuff in there. And I just feel like you really delved so deeply in that you might be able to tell us where we're on the right track and where we're maybe missing the mark.
I think that sounds great. Yeah, I think we can have a great conversation about all three of those points.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'm going to put a piece of wood on the fire so I don't get too cold in here. That's snowing outside here.
Bill, by the way, it looks really cozy.
Thank you. Yeah,
Where are you?
Vashon Island near Seattle. It's a cabin built originally on the back of an old flatbed truck. You can see that there's a curved ceiling over there. There's a 10-foot loft over the cab of the old 47 International Harvester. Speaking of International Harvester. But now it has my percussion, and I'm a percussionist. And
Looks awesome. How did you get into rail?
well, the Pacific Northwest there was an effort to expand export terminals, considering this area sort of a fossil fuel corridor to Asia. And so the idea of expanding coal trains and coal ports and then crude oil ship ports, et cetera, through this very beautiful inland saltwater sea, now referred to as the Salish Sea, was particularly alarming and offensive to put this place at risk in order to fuel that system. And I confronted a guy who was on a panel who worked for BNSF Railroad. He was actually a whistleblower when it came to BNSF, but he was on this panel and he was representing workers. And, they're fighting for every few jobs they can get. And so Mike Elliott is his name. And I went up to him and said, "What are you doing here? You're sitting on a panel with BNSF and Peabody Coal." And he's like, "I don't trust these guys as far as I could kick them. If it was up to me, we'd nationalize the railroads." So I knew there was something interesting about this guy. And a few months later, continuing this conversation, we had this long back and forth. And he said, "Well, I was involved in this 2008 corridor modernization paper around modernizing the Northern Transcon, and I didn't even know what that was at the time." And he said, why don't you see if you and your people can green it? And so because of my social movement background and activist background, I think that whenever you have the opportunity to expand alliances and undermine the alliances of your opponent, and you have an active opponent that's actually willing to come over and engage with you as a potential future ally, I thought that was very worth investing in. And so even though I didn't know anything about it, I started recruiting a team of people who knew more about it. And then we produced a book that was published in 2016 called Solutionary Rail. But that's what got me involved. And it's through that process that I also became quite fascinated by how railroads intersect with so many different sectors in society. To me, if you're building social movement power to fight the collusion between corporate and elected power, you really need to have a very strong alliance. And so seeing something as potentially uniting as rail is inspired me to start really looking into what are the different sectors of societies, what are the tribes, what are the environmental justice urban communities, what are the rural communities, shippers, who's got an interest in the operations of this system and the use of its corridors. And so I continue to be hopeful that it provides a bit of a connecting, something to rally around.
Absolutely. That's fascinating. And I think you're spot on. I think oftentimes the economic interests of the groups that you mentioned, they're not immediately visible and they're hard to sort of understand, but they're critical, but like you need someone to dig into them, to surface them. And so I think it's a great thing you're doing.
Well, speaking of digging into stuff and describing it in a very accessible way, I've been really impressed by your writing and your capacity to communicate these historical trends and the complex relationships and forces at play with consolidation and monopolization, antitrust, and agriculture and the emergence of agribusiness. So I hope you could now maybe walk us through what were the stages in the emergence of anti-monopoly organizing in the U.S. and regulatory structures to protect the public interest from the insatiable greed and monopolistic tendencies of capital.
So I think this instinct of American political organizing to guard against the concentration of power in general goes back to the very beginning of the Republic. From the very beginning, the founders and the founding generation took a variety of concrete steps to make sure that political and economic power is widely distributed and stays that way so that people can govern themselves and govern their own communities instead of being dominated by other people. So, for example, everybody knows about the Constitution, right? With the separation of powers between the branches, between the federal government and the state government. The purpose of that, of course, was to make sure that no person, no political party can concentrate power and undermine the liberty of the public, undermine democracy. But they also, at the same time, took action to restrict the concentration of economic power in the economic sphere. A lot of people don't know this, for example, but Thomas Jefferson wanted to include a provision in the Constitution that would outlaw the creation of monopolies as one of the Bill of Rights. It wasn't ultimately included, but he wanted it in there. But beyond that, as the country was being set up, for example, as we were settling the Northwest territories, one of the first actions Congress took was to restrict the ability of speculators, what we would today call capitalists, to roll up land in the Northwest territories because they wanted the land to go to homesteaders and families who would go and have 250 acres or so to farm and live as independent citizens so that you would have an economic system in those territories that would facilitate democratic life and not the sort of plantation system that was then emerging in the South. Now, over time, those safeguards against concentration of economic power have sometimes been enhanced and well enforced, and sometimes they've been in retreat. As we move forward in the 1850s and 60s, you had just a massive increase in the concentration of wealth in the hands of slave owners in the South, the plantation owners, and their bankers in New York. I saw a chart recently that looked at the value of slaves in the United States after Dred Scott in 1850. And Dred Scott resulted in massive skyrocketing in the value of slaves, which gave plantation owners massive amounts of new power, which is why they became so ferociously opposed to any restrictions on slavery. That concentration of power meant that this oligarchy of about 8,000 plantation owners in the South ultimately was able to launch the Civil War, launch secession. Obviously, there was lots of racism, and there were lots of regular people in the South who supported this secession and all of that. Definitely not discounting it, but power lied with plantation owners who fanned the flames of secession to pursue their own interests. And so, coming out of the Civil War, you had lots of recognition from Lincoln to folks in Congress that they needed to counteract this concentration of power in order to make sure that secession doesn't happen again. And that's what they strived to do with Reconstruction. They passed things like the Homestead Act, which opened up the West to settlement. And of course, there's problems with that. But their goal was to make it so that, just the same as with the Northwest Territories, you had homesteaders settling the land out west, not capitalists buying up the land. They passed the Southern Homestead Act to try to break up the plantations and distribute them to poor whites and former slaves. That was ultimately also trimmed, but the idea was there. They also passed things to make sure that there was broad access to education in the states, and they took other steps to free up the local communities from control over their banking sectors by money center banks in New York and Boston and other money center cities. Unfortunately, that wasn't enough, it turned out. And over the next 30 years after the Civil War, the railroads crisscrossed the country, and these continent-wide projects facilitated the accumulation of a lot of financial power in the hands of Wall Street banking houses. And those banking houses soon started deploying that wealth into other industrial sectors of the economy beyond the railroads. And the way they did that is they started facilitating these roll-ups of different industries into trusts. Basically, they would come and say to all the sugar manufacturers, we'll pay you so that you would delegate control of your company to this board of trustees, which would run essentially 90% of the industry in the interests of the owners, instead of letting them compete freely against each other. And they did that in sector after sector. And by the 1880s, there was widespread alarm at this tendency. We wouldn't use these words today, but the way folks described it at the time is that they felt that we had abolished actual de jure slavery through the Civil War, but now the people were being made into slaves again economically through these centralized trusts. And that alarm fomented a broad-based anti-monopoly movement. Farmers were at the center of this movement, but there were also the early labor unions were involved. Small businesses and merchants were involved. Lots of shippers, merchants who were concerned about the concentration of power in railroads and their ability to essentially pick winners and losers by deciding who do they give discounts to and who do they not give discounts to. That movement grew so much that the concern with trusts became bipartisan. By 1890, basically everyone in Congress was on board. And they passed laws like the Interstate Commerce Act, which established the Interstate Commerce Commission, which folks who are interested in railroads will be familiar with. It prohibited the railroads from picking winners and losers. It required the railroads to not discriminate between shippers, not discriminate between communities. They also passed the Sherman Act of 1890, the Sherman Antitrust Act, which is still the major antitrust law in the country, which outlawed monopolization and outlawed any conspiracy or combination to restrict trade and restrict competition in any part of the commerce of the United States. That's the history of our efforts to combat the concentration of economic power and preserve economic freedom through the 1890s.
I do think it's interesting as you gracefully navigated the conversation around that human beings were equity that people borrowed against. And there was an economic incentive, obviously, for both the people who had slaves and the people who lent the money to sustain that system, that economic system. And then obviously you also raised, and we have to deal with this repeatedly, the very DNA of the railroads, especially in the transcontinental railroads and the land grants. They were fundamentally a tool of genocide and colonization. So we are constantly having to just face those aspects. And I'm certain that there must have been considerable slave labor involved in building railroads, just like there was slave labor involved in building the White House. Anyway, I appreciate that you were navigating that with some grace. And it's interesting that despite the fear of wanting to protect the yeoman farmer, for instance, over the idea of this concentrated wealth of the plantation aristocracy, that we simultaneously also, through the land grants, gave so much of that land to the financiers of the railroads. So it's interesting. And there's an interesting tension there.
I will say part of the Granger movement of the 1880s and sort of this emerging anti-monopoly movement, these folks were not against bigness in and of itself. For the most part here, we're talking about white farmers, although the anti-monopoly movement was, for a time in its inception in the 1880s or so, multiracial and included immigrants as well. But they wanted railroads, right? Because they wanted to get to markets. They recognized that there could be efficiency and advantage in large industrial manufacturing facilities, but they wanted them to serve the public and not the narrow interests of a few banks or a few capitalists. So lots of folks were saying that the railroads should be nationalized. If we're going to have railroads being granted public land and benefiting from it, why do we need to give it to the corporations? Why can't it just be nationalized?
What's your earliest record of that being actually raised? And where did you find that? Because that's fascinating. I mean, I can see it in the early 20th century, but I haven't seen it. And I'm very curious, and I've wondered whether anyone was raising this issue. I can imagine that during Reconstruction, when there was a temporary hold on the concentrated power of the South, the former aristocracy, I can imagine that would be a moment when these ideas would have the capacity to emerge out of the noise, but I haven't seen it.
I think the Populist Party platform of 1892 and 1896, I think both of them called for nationalizing the railroads. And there was a long tradition of these public service corporations being both created and either owned by investors or owned by the public. There's a long tradition, both in the United States and in Britain, of the government sanctioning the creation of corporations that are supposed to build infrastructure that serves the public as a whole. Yeah. It might be a bridge, it might be a canal, it might be a railroad. And there was always some tension about those corporations because they could be instruments of corruption. They could be ways for a small clique of investors to bleed the community dry. And that's what a lot of the concern in the 1840s and 1850s about the internal improvement programs that existed at the time. A lot of the concern about that was that state legislatures around the country were like picking favored groups of investors to build a canal that everyone would have to use and then pay money to those investors for it. So this is a long-standing concern and a long-standing debate. But I think with respect to the railroads and the concentration of power in the late 19th century, the Populist Party platform, I think, definitely called for the nationalization of railroads.
You know, reading W.E.B. Du Bois' Black Reconstruction in America was very interesting. I feel like I need to go back to it because, he really explored a lot of these economic connections that you're talking about. But it would also be fascinating to look back to Lincoln and why the choice was made for the transcontinental railroads to be private. I struggle with this idea that the South both lost the war and in the end lost the battle, but maybe won the war. Because in a way, because of the 3/5 clause and all that stuff, their power and Andrew Johnson and such. So anyway, rolling forward here, bringing us out of the late 19th century and into the 20th century, how did the evolution of antitrust continue?
Yeah, it's a fascinating story, both because it shows us what happens when popular movements slack off and allow corporate interests to burrow into government. But also it demonstrates the ability of the public to really check the power of corporations and bankers and centers of wealth, or malefactors of great wealth, as Theodore Roosevelt called them. So what happened in the 1890s is that I mentioned we passed the Sherman Act in 1890, and it was a big win for the anti-monopoly movement. So it became clear to the corporate interests that they couldn't win the battle in the legislature. And so they took the battle into the courts. There was brief efforts to enforce the law between 1890 and 1895. By 1895, one of the cases that were brought against the Sugar Trust at the time, which rolled up something like 90% of the sugar refineries in the country, it reached the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court decided to gut the Sherman Act. And how they did it was by saying that production and manufacturing activities were not within the scope of the Sherman Act for esoteric reasons we don't need to get into. So the Sherman Act essentially became a nullity. It only applied to railroads, basically. And so after 1895, the Sherman Act was basically nothing. And it set up the 1896 presidential campaign to be a big, giant contest over what is Congress going to do about the trusts now that the Sherman Act has been gutted in this way by the courts. The 1896 campaign was a titanic battle for the ages. You had, on the one hand, the Democratic candidate was William Jennings Bryan. He was the candidate of the Prairie Populists, the Grangers, the Farmers Movement, and they were able to essentially beat the Bourbon Democrats, the ones that represented the Southern planter interests and the banker interests in New York. At the convention, at the Democratic National Convention of 1895, they were able to beat those Bourbon interests out and nominate William Jennings Bryan, this Prairie Populist. He was called the commoner's candidate. And he faced off against William McKinley, the Republican candidate, who was essentially the handpicked candidate of the trusts and financial interests that dominated the nation's economy at the time.
We're renaming Mount Denali, restoring McKinley's name on it. Okay, yeah, keep going.
Yeah, he was basically handpicked by Mark Hanna, who was the Republican machine boss. Mark Hanna was a trading magnate. He went around to bankers and corporations and said, money wins elections, and asked them to donate. He got JP Morgan to pitch in $200 million in today's money. He got folks like Rockefeller to pitch in another $200 million. Eventually, they were able to raise $3 billion in today's money for William McKinley's campaign. They recruited the railroads to bring folks to Canton, Ohio to hear William McKinley's speeches. Something like 500,000 people were given free tickets or extremely discounted tickets on the railroads to come see William McKinley.
Go around and campaign, as I think I learned in your paper.
Right. So William McKinley stayed in Canton, Ohio, and gave speeches from his front porch because he didn't have to go anywhere. The railroads were bringing people to him for free. And then manufacturers pressured workers to vote for William McKinley. A bunch of newspapers that used to lean Democratic abandoned the Democratic Party after they nominated William Jennings Bryan and supported McKinley. So McKinley had all of the money and power behind him, whereas William Jennings Bryan had the money that he collected at rallies by passing the hat. And he made the best of it, went around the country on a whistle-stop tour, invented that from whole cloth, spoke to millions of people in a sort of heroic effort. Unfortunately, in the end, it wasn't enough. When the election results came in, McKinley won by about 4 points or so.
Wow.
And that took the wind out of the sails of the populist movement. After 1896, the Sherman Act was gutted. The bankers, especially JP Morgan, orchestrated one of the biggest merger waves in American history. It's known in economic history as the Great Merger Movement, where they just started combining all of these companies in sector after sector into single monopolies. You had the International Harvester Trust came about in this era. The meat packers bought up a bunch of independent meatpacking operators. You had mergers in all sorts of industries affecting agriculture and affecting everything else. And these mergers involved lots of security issues, lots of speculation in securities. And by 1907, that speculation led to a financial panic, essentially a financial crisis, which reawoke the public to this problem, or rekindled the concern about the problem of monopolization and the financiers' efforts to roll up industries in this way. And that set up what happened in the election of Wilson in 1912 on a platform of the new freedom and restoring free competitive enterprise in the United States. Now, Wilson's tenure is something that started out as a win and ended up as a disaster. Wilson essentially enacted a lot of the agenda of the populists in the 1890s that they wanted in the 1890s. He passed the Federal Reserve Act, which in its original iteration, it was intended to take away power from the money center banks in New York and Chicago and Boston and vest it in these regional Federal Reserve banks, which would be cooperatively owned by local and regional banks. And they would facilitate banking in those regions instead of these, large banking houses in New York and Boston and so forth. He passed the Clayton Act of 1914, which is an antitrust law, which was intended to revitalize the Sherman Act. It sought to restrict corporate mergers, restrict exclusive deals, restrict price discrimination, whereby suppliers could pick winners and losers. And he passed laws that also targeted speculation and deceptive practices in the marketing of grains and livestock and so forth. So there was a big effort there. Unfortunately, in 1916, we went to war. And essentially, Wilson decided that he couldn't pursue the deconcentration of industry under the new laws that he passed because it would be too disruptive during the war. So he was like, we'll put it off until after the war. The problem is that in order to plan the economy to go to war, the government ended up needing to cooperate with the monopolies that Wilson had planned to target. And so it ended up being that, as Wilson actually warned in 1912 when he was running for office, when the government tried to regulate the monopolies instead of breaking them up for the war effort, the monopolies ended up regulating the government. And a great example of this is the Food Administration during the war, which essentially took over the grain and meat sectors of the economy through intensive regulation. But they did that in a way that essentially benefited grain millers and large grain plantations instead of small farmers and instead of consumers. And the same thing happened in the pork industry, which was considered very important. Basically, they established a system that made it so that there was a minimum price for pork and grains, for example, but that was the only price available. It was supposedly a minimum, but it was actually also the maximum. And that minimum price was guaranteed, and it made so that a large farmer, a plantation owner, could probably make a small profit, but a family farmer couldn't make a living on that minimum price for grains or minimum price for hogs. And so the large farmers, they ended up, and lots of folks ended up borrowing lots of money to expand production in an effort to try to make up on volume what they were losing on price. Production soared, which kept prices down, but at least it worked somewhat during the war years. But after the war ended and wartime demand subsided, all that production didn't have anywhere to go. And even the minimum price was taken away. And so prices truly crashed. And that resulted in small farmers being completely wiped out. Basically, a quarter of the farms went out of business in the 1920s as a result. But through it all, the folks who benefited were the large farmers who were able to expand dramatically, the plantation owners, the agribusinesses in the Midwest, and, of course, the millers and traders in grains and the meat packers for hogs, because suddenly they had extremely cheap inputs, and they did throughout the war, which they could sell at high profits because of their monopoly positions in their industries. So that's where we were by the 1920s. Laissez-faire took over the economy in the 1920s. Nobody wanted to enforce the antitrust laws. Nobody believed truly in regulation, partly because of what happened under Wilson, with the failed reforms. People were given hope, and then they were dashed in the most awful ways by the end of World War I. And what ended up happening in the 1920s is you had even more concentration. The Supreme Court went back to gutting the Sherman Act and the Clayton Act. The Clayton Act was intended to revitalize the antitrust laws. The Supreme Court basically did the same thing it had done to the Sherman Act in the 1890s, found ways to make the Clayton Act basically a nullity. And you had yet another merger wave in the 1920s, more consolidation among corporations. You had an agricultural depression that started at the end of World War I and really didn't stop until the late 1930s. That agricultural depression ended up leading to a lot of farm bankruptcies and farm foreclosures, which in turn led to a lot of rural banks and small banks out in the countryside failing. First, trickle, and then it was an avalanche of bank failures. And those eventually led to the financial crash of 1929 that turned the agricultural depression of the 1920s into the Great Depression of the 1930s. That was the end point of the cycle we started in the 1890s. Basically, we gave the reins to financiers and captains of industry to run our economy as they saw fit. And what it yielded for us is a system that encouraged just rampant overproduction, that encouraged rampant speculation, and ultimately resulted in the greatest crash of any time in American history.
This is leading up to your next aspect of the book, then is 30s to the 70s. I really appreciate you going into all this detail. One of the things that struck me around the World War I period is that that was another instance where a crash in grain production in a place like Ukraine actually made U.S. grain exports yet more important. I read a book about the worst hard times, or whatever the name of that book is, but about the panhandle in Texas, the Dust Bowl, and how the railroads actually recruited those farmers to come out from places like the steppes of Eastern Europe to do dryland wheat farming. And this phenomenon of lower prices, meaning that they had to plow up more prairie in order to put out more, to get less, even though they were getting less and less, they had to raise more and more, the glut of the market. So, I guess we've always been exporting one thing or another, whether it was tobacco or beaver pelts or cotton. Was the U.S. an agricultural export of grains from early on as well? Or was that something that emerged around World War I? Or is that even relevant?
I mean, I think it is relevant. I do think before World War I, you didn't have as much of the export focus. And I don't think that export markets were as important for agriculture as they became after World War I. And, I think this goes back to the point that you were making earlier about sort of, we regulate for the type of economic structure that we want to have. And I think in large part, the efforts before the World War I were aimed at creating a system where farmers could get, and farmers were most people in those days, could get a fair price for their crops in local and regional markets. I think certainly a lot of farmers wanted access to faraway markets, and that's why the railroads were supported. But I think a lot of what folks were opposed to was the idea that a middleman between the farmer and between the consumer would just abuse that middleman position in order to reap outsized profits. That could be the railroad that does that. It could be a company like Cargill that trades grains. It could be the millers, right, which is also Cargill and other corporations. And railroad regulation, in addition to antitrust enforcement, they can either facilitate a system where there's lots of middlemen and they're not reaping a lot of the profits, or we can facilitate a system that encourages middlemen to consolidate and allows them to be the prime beneficiaries of the trading that's going on.
Fascinating. So just noting that during World War I, we took the railroads under national management. Coming out of World War I, there were a variety of plans. The Plum Plan is one that's getting discussed a great deal right now by some of the folks that we're allied with. But there was a concept of relooking at consolidation of railroads and rail yards. And that was supposed to be explored in 1929, which then didn't happen because of the crash of the stock market. And the other thing that I found fascinating recently is the trends in immigration patterns and immigration controls, and how in 1924, about the same period that we're talking about, we started to close off immigration and make it harder for non-Northern and Western European people to come into the country. This is a Gordian knot But going back, reeling back to after World War II and the Depression, and how does this 1930s to 1970s period play out in terms of antitrust and anti-consolidation?
What's really interesting about that period is that it solves that Gordian knot that you talked about. And it provides a model for how we can create an economy where economic power is not concentrated and where markets offer opportunities for people and serve as vehicles to serve the public interest instead of the public serving the markets. What happened is that early in the Depression, the Roosevelt administration essentially adopted a model that was very similar to what Wilson did during World War I. They thought that the way to jumpstart the economy again was that you needed to plan the economy, you needed to regulate industries. And so they set up the National Recovery Administration, which was very similar to the War Industries Board of 1916 during World War I. And basically they thought this recovery administration would facilitate essentially cartelization in each industry and bring together labor and the biggest companies, and they would come up with sets of rules for how they were going to run the industry, price levels, profit levels, output levels, et cetera. And it was kind of a disaster, really, because it ended up privileging the position of the dominant corporations that had been formed through the merger waves of the 1920s. And by 1936 or so, that failure was obvious because as the economy finally recovered from the Great Depression, as it was climbing out of the darkest days, the dominant corporations used that reemergence of the economy, what we would call today the supply chain shocks of that reemergence, as an excuse to hike prices. And so they started hiking prices across the economy. The FTC got something like 500 complaints a month of price gouging in 1936. And the problem with that is that when they raised prices, people couldn't afford to buy the things anymore. And so that would end up causing corporations to lay off more people, reducing output more, but keeping prices high. Because they're monopolists. They have financial power. They can stay in business. They just don't want to reduce their profits on whatever it is they're producing. They want to keep making profits on invested capital. And that ended up resulting in sort of the short recession of 1936. And that's when things started clicking in the Roosevelt administration that the problem in the economy isn't that there's not enough control. It's that the control is in the hands of these monopolistic corporations. Robert Jackson, who was the head of the antitrust division at the time, was an architect of this vision. He went around the country giving speeches about how monopolistic corporations were hampering the economic recovery through exercise of their power, and how we needed to launch a campaign against that. And that's exactly what the Roosevelt administration and the Truman administration after it did. And they did it in four ways. On the one hand, there was antitrust enforcement. The government launched thousands of cases, literally, in those years, and ended up over the course of the decade breaking up hundreds of monopolies, hundreds of cartels. So that was one part. The other part was regulating competition, regulating trade so that it's fair and on the merits. So the FTC went on its own campaign to rid the country of practices that were perpetrated by dominant corporations in different industries in order to hamper small business entry and restrict the ability of rivals to dislodge them. So a good example of that is that, for example, you had sugar refiners giving discounts, unjustified high discounts to established candy manufacturers, but not giving them to others in violation of the Clayton Act, the prohibition on price discrimination. And the result was that the established candy manufacturers, they're the only ones who could sell candy at a competitive price. And that was mutually beneficial for the sugar manufacturers because they had an established relationship and everyone could sort of be happy with things as they are.
When was that?
This was the 1930s and 1940s. So you had the Federal Trade Commission use the existing laws, the Clayton Act and the Federal Trade Commission Act, which prohibits unfair methods of competition, to impose these kinds of rules prohibiting these kinds of unfair practices. And then the third thing they did was utility regulation, and railroad regulation was a big part of that. The idea was that if you want to have an economy where everyone has a fair shot, where lots of folks can participate in any kind of industry, they need to be able to access railroad shipping on a fair basis. If the railroads can give discounts to the largest players in any given industry, then the small players just can't compete. And eventually they'll wither on the vine. And so that's what they tried to do, is make it so that railroad service was extended to all parts of the country, and railroads were not allowed to discriminate between shippers. A similar thing was done in airline transportation, and the similar things were done in electric utilities and telecom utilities. For example, in electric utilities, there was an FTC investigation, and this is relevant to railroads. An FTC investigation found that a handful of holding companies that were backed by large financial interests, they had rolled up the electric power generation and electric transmission companies across the country. And because there was a lack of competition, they essentially said, we can make high profits in the large urban markets we're already established. There's limited competition, so why should we invest more capital in outlying areas to get lower profits? The FTC found that it wasn't necessarily that investing money in outlying areas would be unprofitable. It's just that it would have been less profitable. And so in the absence of competition in the urban markets, these dominant holding companies were just like, why bother? And so through an act of Congress in the late 1830s.
In the late 1930s?
1930s, yes, not 1830s. They passed the Public Utility Holding Act, which broke up these holding companies. And they also passed the Rural Electrification Act, which helped communities essentially bypass the investor-owned electric industry and set up their own electric generation facilities. So, what happened after that in the 1940s and 1950s is suddenly you started seeing competition in urban markets that drove at least some investor-owned utilities to think, maybe we should expand into those areas that are not served right now. In those areas, we'll have less competition than we have here. Maybe we can make a little bit more profits. And on top of that, there was the cooperative electric utilities, which provided competition for the investor-owned utilities also in rural communities and made sure that everyone could get access to electric power at fair and reasonable prices. The fourth leg of the sort of New Dealers' effort to rebuild a competitive economy was financial regulation and securities regulation. There were antitrust investigations into the banking sector that sort of broke up various types of cartels between banking institutions. There were also securities laws that made securities markets more honest and less prone to speculation and crashes and all of that. A byproduct of that was that a small business that was growing could seek capital on the merits from the public markets. And in addition to facilitate that, the New Dealers also set up laws and programs to help credit unions, thrift associations, and other sort of cooperative associations set up financial institutions to serve local communities. In any community in the country at that point, a small business could access capital on fair terms. They could access railroads and airline service so that they could get to markets in other parts of the country. They weren't being excluded from market opportunities by dominant players in large urban centers. And as a result, from the 1950s to the 1970s, we had one of the most dynamic economies in the world. It was good for business, it was good for farmers, it was good for consumers, and it was good for workers at the end of the day.
Wow. Now, I can imagine that World War II must have played a part in the boom time as well. Of course, for a period, we were the only surviving center of manufacturing, I guess. But then obviously others reestablished themselves, but also we gained access to formerly colonial markets and such. So I can see how there's this boom opportunity. It is protecting, it's leveling the playing field.
I should note there that, like, yes, those sort of opportunities with foreign markets existed, and they probably contributed to the prosperity or like the wealth accumulation in the United States. I don't know enough about that, but I imagine that that's true. But the distribution of that wealth is different. The distribution of those opportunities was different in the 1950s and 1960s, right? It wasn't just a handful of corporations that benefited from that. It was large numbers of small businesses, and the gains, legitimate or not, from that were distributed widely in the economy.
Well, I think that's a really great clarification and a really great point, important point, that it's not just about the opportunities, it's the distribution of how those opportunities are shared or not shared. And so when did the shift in antitrust regulation through, you identified in your paper that Robert Bork played a role in that, in interpreting the public interest was really more about consumers. And, I recently even heard about Ralph Nader sort of being identified as also sort of a neoliberal, a champion of a kind of neoliberalism. It's an interesting shift. So how does this period from 1970s to the current time period, a period of globalization and concentration and a reorientation of the economic goals of this system, start shaping the current reality and potentially the sense of grievance that's experienced by communities and participants in the economy, whether they be folks involved in farming itself or the connected industries?
Basically, in the late 1970s and the 1980s, there was a return of laissez-faire sentiment, the same sentiment from the 1920s in both parties. The Carter administration passed the Staggers Act, which deregulated the railroads to a large extent and allowed them to discriminate between shippers once again, something that had been prohibited since the 1890s. They stopped enforcing the laws against price discrimination in the economy generally under the Clayton Act, those laws that prohibited a supplier from giving discounts to competing customers that weren't justified by economies of scale. And then in 1982, the Reagan administration essentially said it was not going to enforce the restrictions on mergers that had been established in the 1940s and 1950s. Before the 1982, essentially starting in 1950, companies could not acquire substantial competitors of theirs. They could not acquire a customer that was a substantial customer opportunity for their rivals and foreclose them from that customer. They couldn't acquire a substantial supplier for the same reason. Now, suddenly in 1982, only mergers to monopoly were the target of enforcement. And as a result, it was like turning a switch. Suddenly, you saw a massive merger wave take off in industry after industry. You had manufacturers in particular across the economy struggling to compete with the largest players because of the deregulation of railroads and because of other deregulation pushes across the economy. And that ultimately resulted in the economy we have today, where not only do you have, say, 2, 3, or 4 companies dominant, or in some cases, one company truly dominating in almost every industry you can think of, but it is extremely difficult to dislodge them because of the fact that small businesses can't have access to the rails on fair terms, because the small businesses can't access the markets. They can't access customers on fair terms. They can't access supplies that they need on fair terms because the dominant incumbents are extracting unfair discounts from those suppliers, or they're imposing exclusive contracts on their customers so that customers can't switch to a small upstart that's trying to compete. And ultimately that yields an economy where most parts of the country and most people don't have control over their economic destinies.
Right.
It restricts the liberty of individuals and communities. Right now, in lots of rural communities, where you used to have local banks and local manufacturers and local businesses that could make the local economy hum, now those rural communities are dependent for even access to groceries on an out-of-town, absentee-owned grocery chain. Their local manufacturing plant isn't owned by someone who anybody knows it's owned by a faceless national or global corporation that no one can hold accountable. And I think that is a big part of the moment we find ourselves in politically, is that I think a lot of people on a personal level, they're feeling the pinch of this concentration of economic power, because when there's not a lot of employers that are competing for your labor that you can jump to, if you're displeased with your employer, you can't make as high wages. They're feeling the pinch at the grocery store when a cartel of egg producers is jacking up the price of eggs unnecessarily. But they're also, I think, realizing that it's really hard for them to come together and do anything about it because the markets are so concentrated. And that's why they want something different. They want a new deal, something to shake the current system that we have. Maybe people don't say it in these words, but that's, I think, a big part of the frustration that people feel that drives the sentiment that, maybe we should tear it all down and maybe we should vote for somebody who's a wrecking ball. David Dayen talks about this at the American Prospect. He's like, people have been voting for change since 2008. They've gone from one party to the other in an effort to find change, fundamental change in the economy, especially in the aftermath of the great financial crisis, which showed that the economic model we've been pursuing since the 1980s, this laissez-faire model that said, let the bankers and the corporate executives do whatever they want. They know best. They wanted to change that, but they didn't get it. They didn't get the change they wanted. The Obama administration facilitated more concentration in banking. The big banks got even bigger. The Obama administration facilitated more concentration in healthcare, more concentration in agriculture. They even promised, for example, that they would pass regulations that would ensure fairness and transparency in livestock markets so that small farmers aren't getting screwed by chicken processors and meat packers. And then they backed off of that by the end of the administration under industry pressure. So I think people got increasingly disillusioned. And the question is today, are we going to address that frustration or are we not? We have a model to do it. We have a model to do it from the 1930s and 1940s, a similar moment in many ways, where people had tried for 20 years prior, right? They tried through Wilson. They tried through the Theodore Roosevelt administration in the 1910s to get reform, and it failed, and it led to disaster. And then finally, they were able to get the New Deal that they wanted through the Franklin Roosevelt administration. Hopefully, we don't have to go through the same type of disaster as the Great Depression and everything that came with it in order to make the same reforms. But that's the dangerous moment we're in.
Wow. Wow, thank you so much for spending the time. Now I'm thinking about 1976 and the first exemptions for growing fruits and vegetables, and the railroads didn't have to cover them. I think of NAFTA and how that impacted farmers, not just here, but also in Mexico, and how that impacts immigration patterns and, Citizens United. So all of this is very fruitful, very stimulating. I really appreciate you taking the time. I know you've got to stop now, and I'll let you get to that call, but I would love to talk with you more.
I appreciate that. And it's been great talking to you. Sorry if I monologued too much. Sorry if I went into detail, but I hope it was interesting.
Totally. It was like getting a book on tape. It was awesome. All right, cool. Thanks a lot.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me. Great to meet you guys.
Take care.
That was Basel Musharbash, author of Kings Over the Necessaries of Life, Monopolization and the Elimination of Competition in America's Agricultural System, in conversation with Solutionary Rail Director and Reconnect America host, Bill Moyer. You can find a link to Basel's paper in the show notes. Thank you to Oda Proda for the theme music. If you like what you heard in this interview and think more people should hear it, please be sure to like, subscribe, and share it with your friends. And you can also support this work by pitching in and getting involved at solutionaryrail.org.